My name's Judd Hendricks, and I want to welcome you to our beloved Community Learning Lab. This is a program that we are hosting every Thursday, and I want to welcome you today. We are in the middle of a series looking at violence reduction. And so we started earlier in February and looked at research around violence reduction. And today we've got a really amazing panel looking at raising awareness and shaping a new narrative, the roles of art and media in reducing violence. And so we've got a really amazing group of folks that are joining us today. So I want to welcome all of you that are with us. Each month, the Beloved Community, which is a new initiative that we're starting to create a racial justice city. Each month we take a different action constellation and that we think is essential for creating a racially just city. And we create programs on Thursdays called the Learning Lab, where we go deeper into these issues. And one of the issues that we've chosen is how do we reduce violence as a city? So I want to welcome you to that conversation. If you're joining us on Zoom, welcome. There'll be a moment later where you can ask your questions. We'll invite you to unmute yourself at that point and join in the conversation. If you're joining us on Facebook, thanks for joining us there. And you can also put your name or put your comment, or if you have a question, in the chat box, and we will bring that into our conversation as we go. So thanks for joining us on Facebook Live as well. I want to invite you to also think about joining us next week. We've got a really exciting program where we're in the conversation topic is who's doing what, a panel conversation on organizational stakeholders working in the space of violence reduction. And we've got 6, I think, panelists for next week. And they're all doing really amazing things. So come back and join us next Thursday at 3 o'clock as well. Our whole series on violence reduction will come to kind of a crescendo with a community-wide summit called the Reckoning Forum, where we highlight 4 individuals who are doing work in the area of violence reduction, but who are under-resourced. So please put Tuesday, March the 2nd at 6 o'clock p.m. on your schedule and be ready to take some actions to support some of our truth tellers that are doing really great work in this area. We invite you to come back and join us for that. So let's jump into our topic. There were 173 deaths and 550 non-fatal gunshots last year in Louisville, Kentucky, making it one of the most violent years in our history. And this is just the interpersonal violence, not to mention the systemic violence of racism that has been part of our city's history. Today, with the help of our panel, we are looking at the role of media and artists to raise our collective awareness, change the current narratives, and help us to create a more peaceful community. As you listen today, we hope that you'll be asking yourself this question: what actions can I take to decrease violence in our city? So we are very aware that we have a lot of conversations, and everybody's saying these conversations really need to lend to specific actions that we're doing. So at the end of our conversation, I'm going to ask those of you that are on the Zoom call to share what you're going to do today or this week specifically to reduce violence in our city. We have an amazing panel with us today. We have Vita Morgan, who is the Director of Engagement, Diversity, and Opinion at the Courier Journal. And she's been doing some awesome work. You all have probably seen the op-eds and what she's been writing on. Thank you, Vita, for being with us. We also have Kristin Pierce, who's a news anchor at WHAS. And she's currently doing this really great program called Moments That Matter, Our Black History. And those have been really good, Kristin. Thanks for your leadership in those. And if you haven't been watching those, tune into her, and that's a really great series. We also have Brian Warren. He's a senior consultant with the Office of Globalization and also the Vice President of Education and Community Arts at Kentucky Performing Arts. And he's also a local artist. And then also Lance Newman. Many of you all know Lance Newman. He's a local prophetic poet and the director of the Young Poets of Louisville. And speaking of violence, we want to say apology to Lance for the violence that we did to his hair and the picture that we put out in our publicity. So sorry for that violence, Lance, to your hair.
Yeah, no worries.
What I'd like to do is to invite our panelists, and Vito, I'll start with you. And I've asked our panelists if they would introduce themselves a little bit more, share about some of the work they're doing, and share a little bit of their story. So Vita, thank you so much for being with us. And can you share a little bit about what you do and some of your story?
Yes, I can. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I have been with the Courier-Journal for more than 25 years. Oh, and my cat is here. And I started as a neighborhoods reporter, and I moved to the Metro desk where I covered education, mainly Jefferson County Public Schools. I moved back to neighborhoods as an assistant editor and then became neighborhoods editor. I've been lifestyles manager, so that I was over neighborhoods and features. And I was named news director in 2014, where I was over the whole staff. I moved to director of community impact in 2018, where I oversaw opinion and community forum sections and handled letters to the editor and, just all kinds of opinion pieces from readers. And last year I was promoted to my current position, where I still oversee opinion and community engagement, but also focus on diversity. And I work to direct coverage of race and diversity and inclusion issues, and to broaden the conversation on race and diversity. I also direct our Metro columnist, Joe Girth, and 2 reporters, Bailey Loosemore and Hayes Gardner, who spent much of the last year covering the racial justice protests and spending days and evening with protesters, writing about the movement, and also spending months researching on systemic racism and doing a special 8-day project on that called Beyond Brianna. I also work with our features reporters as well. As far as who I am a wife, I am a mother, I have a grown daughter, and I have a 19-year-old son. He would say he's grown, I would say he's grown-ish. I am a person of faith. I'm involved in my church. I teach children and youth in Sunday school classes. I lead a women's small group. I'm passionate about education and about connecting with our community and telling the stories that really matter. And at such a time as this, I'm thankful to be in this job and to be here in Louisville. And that's my story.
Beautiful. Thank you, Vita. Thanks so much for the wisdom that you're sharing and the work that you're doing. Kristin, if you could unmute yourself and share some of your story and the work that you do in this space.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be among this panel. I started off in actually Toledo before moving on to Detroit, but my name is Kristin Pierce, first off. I'm a morning anchor at WHAS 11. I've reported in Detroit, New Orleans, and now Louisville. And I will say, since we're talking about violence, I think that in different cities, how violence is covered is different, but I will say that it's overwhelmingly covered when it comes to Black people and different ethnic groups. And so I think for my role, it's very important to be that diverse voice sometimes. And that's why I think that sometimes with crime and different subjects, it really reveals disparities in our society. And so I think sometimes when we talk about diversity, though, it's always Black and white. And that's simply not just diversity. Diversity also has to do with age, background, sexual orientation, just a number of things that make a newsroom diverse. And so I'm definitely an advocate for having diverse people in newsrooms and also diverse stories in newsrooms. We shouldn't just see Black people when it comes to crime, and we shouldn't just see another group when it comes to racism. And so I've been very opinionated about making sure that we are covering a range of stories. And I know that you mentioned our Black history coverage, and it's called Moments That Matter. And I think that that's a really nice opportunity. Of course, it shouldn't just be February, but a nice opportunity to kind of highlight Black people in a different light than sometimes you see them in like the media. And it's not just me that's doing the series. I have to say that it's a group and it's a team of us that's doing it, because I could not do the entire month by myself. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. Just definitely an advocate for diversity in newsrooms.
Great. Thanks, Kristin. We'll look forward to delving a little bit deeper into some of those issues that you're raising. Brian, if you would unmute yourself, welcome. Thanks for being on the program today. And also didn't mention that Brian is actually the board president of Interfaith Paths to Peace. So he's got his arms and legs and hands and mind in a lot of different things. Brian, thanks for being on today.
Thanks for the invitation, Judd. And what a great opportunity to be with these other great panelists. I'm actually here probably more to hear what you're doing and learn from you than to really offer too much wisdom. But I found myself here in Louisville 20 years ago, and in a path that started really with being an artist. I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, prior to being here, and find myself working in community-based arts in a studio in downtown Birmingham with a bunch of artists who really didn't know what community-based art making was, or how the arts could impact a community. We kind of just kind of fumbled through it, but we found by being down in a downtown neighborhood in the right next to the largest housing project in Alabama, that there was a rich culture and an opportunity to engage with communities that were disenfranchised and not as participatory in the larger arts community. And so we found our space turning into kind of a nexus where the community would find a place where they could be creative and do work, and it was called Space 111. And we worked with a lot of youth to begin with, because they just started showing up at our back door. We had a clay studio, and I was working back there, and these kids showed up, and they're like, "What are you doing in there?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm making art. I'm making these clay art pieces." And they said, "Well, can we do that?" And it just turned into this organic moment. I mean, I see Lance kind of shaking his head, but you find that when you begin engaging with people, they figure it out, and they help guide you where they need to go. And that led to some really amazing things. I was there for 6 years. We created a program that was called City Center Art, which engaged youth in creative placemaking. We didn't call it that at the time, but it was engaging in art projects that would help beautify their neighborhood. And that led to a really large project in Birmingham to create a giant mural between the art museum and the big auditorium that was created by the people of Birmingham. And so we worked for 6 years to have 35,000 individuals in Birmingham create single personalized clay tiles that we turned into a 50-foot tall, 100-foot long tile mural for the city of Birmingham. It was amazing. And then that project led to other opportunities. We didn't think about economic development at the time, but we were providing opportunities for kids over the summer to be employed because they needed money, right? So we created a summer works program. And then that program led into a project in which we were able to employ their parents to work in the studio to create projects that the kids designed and envisioned as representations of their community. And so that experience kind of just led me along this path to really thinking about how the arts can be real powerful factors in kind of changing people's personal determination and how communities see themselves. And then 20 years ago, moved here to Louisville, started at the Portland Museum over in the West End. I know most people know that wonderful little institution. And what drew me to that was the fact that it was a museum that started out of a vision to archive and honor the history of a neighborhood. Right? It started as a classroom project and turned into a full-blown institution. And what you see, I mean, if you haven't been down to the Portland Museum recently, I mean, it's really wonderful. Not only do they have the old historical museum, but they're working on this kind of like I guess, kids engagement space that's right next door, which is really, really beautiful. So I'm really excited about that. But all of that, has led me through this path of finding work and jobs in the arts that, really talk about transforming community engagement with institutions and empowering them to, kind of see themselves within their own communities and to raise their voices and to reveal truths that, sometimes get hidden without that opportunity. So the other two things several other things, have occurred along the way. I worked at the Speed Art Museum as education curator, doing outreach programs out into a lot of communities. I was most proud of, our work reaching into the West End and with the Native American communities and our immigrant communities there. Then I was director of a place called Crane House, which is the Asian Cultural Institute. And we worked to turn that into an institution that was much inward reflective of the large Asian diaspora that's here in Louisville, Kentucky. And then the stop before the Kentucky Center for the Arts was with the mayor's office, and I directed the Office for Globalization, really kind of pushing our efforts in the city to be more welcoming to our foreign-born neighbors and residents, and create a city that is really dynamic for all of us. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But I also make art. I'm still an artist myself. I curate shows. And like Vida, I have kids, but they're both grown kids. And so I'm not dealing with young kids during a pandemic in my house. So I really feel for parents, but my boys are fairly self-sufficient and off on their own. So, but that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for being on. And Lance, if you would share a little of your story and the work that you're doing. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate the invite, everyone. Looking forward to having this conversation. So my name is Lance G. Newman II, also known as Mr. Spread Love around the city. I started to perform poetry about 16 years ago in Louisville. And that journey has really kind of taken me on this multifaceted, multidisciplinary journey with my artistry. So it's really kind of hard where I should start, honestly, but I'll start with how most people are introduced to me. So poetry, I've had a long run in Louisville, hosting, facilitating, and creating opportunities for spoken word to be enjoyed by the masses. This looks like the KMAC Poetry Slam, which has been running for 6 years now. This looks like poetry operas such as the West End Poetry Opera, The Blood Always Returns, and the Smoketown Poetry Opera. Each of these poetry operas or plays were created with the help of Roots and Wings, which was a multidisciplinary artistry group that I helped to found. So poetry-wise, that's kind of what I've been doing in the city. But again, I wear many hats. So I'm also a teacher and an educator. I teach creative writing and public speaking in various schools, juvenile detention centers, and community centers. And I've been facilitating that curriculum for about 10 years now. So a lot of the younger folks, that's how they get introduced to me. And I've done a lot of work in the community centers and when I say work, I mean literally working as one of the community center liaisons, cleaning up after folk and putting out balls for sports and all that other good stuff. So my connection with the community is just heavy as deep, right? I was not born in Louisville, but I was definitely raised here and spent all my education in Louisville and Kentucky. So it's very close to my heart. And yeah, there's like so much more. I'm a theater, I'm an actor. I'll be in Actors Theater's Romeo and Juliet coming up next month. And there's so much more, but you all can Google me for that.
Great, Lance. There is a lot more there. Thanks for being on today. So let's get into the weeds on this a little bit. So the beloved community, one of the things that we were looking at is how do we create a racially just city, which is the overview of the work that we're trying to do. And it quickly became apparent that the issues that surround violence are deeply connected to race. They're deeply connected to what's happening in Louisville. And we've been trying to walk this balance between the reality that we had 155 people shot and killed or homicides in Louisville. And the majority of those that were the victims were, I think they were saying 73% were Black. And so how do we hold up the narrative there and tell this story that's just striking, that there are 155 families that don't have a loved one? And why is not everybody know that? Like, why is that not in everybody's awareness that this is happening in our community? While also being careful to not paint violence as being a Black thing or a West Louisville thing, and making sure we talk about systemic racism that is perpetuated on minority cultures by whiteness, by the violence that white people do through their both their intention and their lack of intention and awareness. And so as we're trying to unpack violence and what we can do to reduce it, we're trying to be careful with those narratives. And so what was really important about today's session was, who do we turn to that are creating the cultural narratives? What are these narratives that are being shaped? Who is responsible for them? What's the responsibility of media in those? Both raising awareness, but also not buying into traditional narratives, and also the prophetic role of art to raise awareness, but to engage these deeper issues. So I want to jump back up to the media folks. Vida and Kristin, what is the role and the responsibility that media has in reducing violence and engaging these narratives in a responsible way? And how do we do that? So if y'all could, jump in and share.
So I'll jump in first and say that clearly the media has a huge role in shaping the narratives around violence. The way we tell a story, how we focus it, who we talk to, how we identify people and the neighborhoods can all impact the message that we send to the community. If we only cover a community when there's crime, then we shape the narrative. We tell people that that's a problem place. If we only talk to the police, which is an easy get for the media, but don't talk to the families, don't tell the stories of the people most affected by violence, don't ask the tough questions. Why were the police at Breonna's apartment serving a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night? If we don't ask the questions, if we don't search for the information, if we don't request the records, the 911 tapes, the video footage, if we don't do the digging, if we fail to do our jobs, is basically what I'm saying, then we contribute to a false narrative. If we only show photos of people of color in a negative light, then we contribute to a false narrative. So, and the reverse is true too. If we do our jobs, if we cover the whole community and all the issues that are important to various communities, if we investigate the circumstances around violence in our communities, and if we ask, why are so many Black people being affected by violence? And if we ask questions like, why are police pulling over so many more Black people than they are white people? Why are Black people 3 times more likely to be incarcerated as white people? And if we get the real answers and tell those stories, then we help shape the narrative that leads to a true picture of the communities and the people who live in them. So, and I believe having people like me and having people like Kristin in newsrooms is going to help us bring more attention to actually covering the whole neighborhood, to actually asking the right questions that can help shape the true narrative. So yeah, media is extremely important in this situation.
Thanks, Vida. Kristin, jump in.
I think as a member of the media, we have a responsibility to get it right. We are a source that a lot of people go to for their information, whether or not they are reading a newspaper or watching the actual news, they are going online to get their information. And for the most part, we are a huge resource in providing that information. For me, I also think it's that level of how responsible are we doing and how of a job are we doing in being equal with how we cover crime. And I say that to say, we often see, or we will hear vague descriptions of suspects when they're Black. We'll hear, it's a Black man, 6 feet tall. Well, that's my dad, that's my cousin, that's my brother, that's so many people, that's just a Black man to me, like you can't do that. You have to be specific. And then you have to also be honest with yourself. Do we give those vague descriptions when it's a white man? We don't. You don't often hear that on the news or anywhere online. It was a white man, 6 feet. It's not like that. It's very specific. He had a tattoo, something that identified him and makes him stand out in the crowd. And to go off beta too, the statistics show it. Black people are 3 times more likely to be shot by police, even though they are more likely to be unarmed. And when we cover crime and we cover police involved crime, we have to think about those things. We have to think about, why were they pulled over in the first place? Is it driving while Black, which is a thing? And just looking at actually listening to people. And I think that we have a responsibility to do that and to humanize people, because everyone that's involved in gang violence or everyone that's involved in street violence is not a bad person, and everyone does not deserve to die. And so I think sometimes if we just cover this person and show their mugshot, that automatically paints a picture that they're a criminal. And everyone that we lose to violence is someone's son, is someone's daughter, someone loves them. So if we don't have this accurate picture of who they are as a person, then we're kind of doing a disservice to our community. And I think that too, it's been proven that we can't always believe officials. We would love to think that we could, and in an ideal world we would, but that's been proven that we cannot every time. So it's important to ask those questions, those follow-up questions. Maybe when this is what happened, this is what police say, well, what else happened? Just going one step further and one step deeper to actually dig a little bit to get the accurate perception or the real answer about what happened. And if we don't get it from them, go into the community, because a lot of times people know what happened, but if you only go there when there's crime, maybe they don't want to talk to you. If you only go there when there's bad news, they may not want to talk to you, and you can't fault them for that, because there's a responsibility from the media to get to know the community that we serve. And the way that we portray certain groups in the news is so important, because sometimes for a lot of people, we like to think that we're diverse and we interact with so many different people outside of those that are like us. But the reality is this might be someone's first encounter or only encounter with someone that doesn't look like them. So they only see them in a mugshot, or they only see them at a crime scene. That is their image and their perception of an entire group of people. And so that's why we'll hear the stories of Black people, especially Black men, walking past someone and someone grabbing their purse a little tighter and feeling uncomfortable in small spaces like an elevator, or people locking their doors to their cars when a Black person walks by. And because in a sense, maybe it's possible that they have only seen this group of people in negative roles, in negative stories, and never in the media smiling, being happy, being human. And so we play a huge role in that, because a lot of people look to the news, as they should, in my opinion, to get the information that they need in order to be informed, in order to feel safe, in order to know what's going on in their community.
Thanks, Kristin. I want to go back to kind of to both of you. What's been your experience of, have your organizations been open to the changing in these narratives? Like, what's been the challenge that you faced in the spaces where you work? I can imagine that being difficult, especially that historically a lot of these organizations have been owned by white people. The power structures have often been people who are white or male. How has that been in your spaces to change that narrative, or to bring in that reflective piece around the diversity and inclusion?
I would say that is why it is so important also to have a diverse workforce. It's important to have people in the room who are not all the same. And it's important to have people in the room who are willing to speak up. I've been there for a long time and I don't have a problem speaking up. We also have a diversity committee at the Courier-Journal. And it's great to have a group of, I don't know, there's more than a dozen folks on that committee. And their they make it their business and their main job to look at everything we do, to look at what's happening in the community and to raise issues about why aren't we writing this story? You know, they just opened this great, you know, this big development, you know, in the West End. We need to be covering that. They make it an issue to make sure that, you know, that we're on our toes, and it's good to have a group like that. It's important, but we still need to do better with our hiring. We need to do better because you need to reflect the community that you cover. That is an essential way to make sure that what we're reporting, and you need to be in that community. I'll say that too. You gotta go past 9th Street. You gotta be in the community and not just, you know, when there's an issue. But, you know, if we're going to be able to accurately cover the community, we got to be there. And that's, I felt like with the protests, you know, that's what we did. I had a little bit of a problem at first because it felt like we were just running out there because there was, you know, violence taking place and there was strife and there was, you know, tear gas and all this stuff. And after a couple of days, I'm going, this is a movement. We have to have people who are there all the time talking to protesters. And that's what we did. You know, we put reporters there with them to tell their stories, to live that experience. It is so essential to, you know, having the narrative be correct.
Kristin, how about you? What's been your experience?
I think I have to pick my words carefully sometimes. I think we're on the right track, and I'm seeing a lot of different organizations really put the work in to make changes, and not just changes for right now, but changes that will be long lasting. In my experience, I'm sometimes one of a handful of people in the newsroom that look like me, and it's worth the fight. It really is. It's absolutely worth the fight. You have to be an advocate for different groups, and you have to be an advocate for what you believe in. And there's no way to instill change or force that change if you're silent. And so it's worth the fight to get your point across. And sometimes people don't know that they're ignorant to what you're trying to bring to them until you bring it to them. So you can't, in a sense, fault people for not knowing if you also don't try to inform them. And I find that when you do that, sometimes people are a little more open-minded than you think they are, but it's definitely worth the fight every single time. And because we're so needed, diversity is so needed to be in the room, but also to be listened to. It's not enough to just be that face. You have to be that voice as well. And it changes small things that you may not realize at first, but little things like terminology, how we refer to people, you know, how we're showing people in videos. And so those are the things that seem small and they seem minor, but they really make a difference long term and down the line. And if it's not right for you, then it'll be right for the next person, which is always important too. When I think about things like that, I think about back in the day when they were fighting to get free for slavery. There were slaves that never saw freedom, but they still fought for it. So you have to still continue to fight for things that you feel so passionate about. And I think that things are changing now to not be kind of like the token Black person, because that is the thing. And just not being saying like, oh, well, we hit the quota with diversity. No, we're actively trying to diversify newsrooms and diversify coverage and making sure that we are including everyone. And we also formed a diversity and inclusion board at WHAS, and definitely very active in making sure that how we cover things, we're covering them correctly, and that different groups of people will see our coverage and go, okay, they got that right.
Thank you, Kristin. I want to bring in Lance and Brian here, other folks that are involved in shaping narrative in our culture. And Brian, jump in with, what do you think is art's role in raising awareness and being prophetic in that? And also, if you wanted to share the project that you did around gun violence, I thought was very interesting.
Well, I think art, has a different narrative creation. It's it kind of generates itself out of, I don't know if you call it liminal space or a place where, words don't work as well. News coverage is important. But I think when you look at art, it is that, kind of interstitial tissue that can bring together, fact, passion, truth, and and opportunity into one space, and and I think that the one thing that I find interesting about creativity is that there's, no matter what kind of background or situation you come from, that is something that all humans have and have capacity for, and everyone has a story to share. Art often is the vehicle in which we can share that story. But I also see it, and particularly in my work, that art can encompass a variety of initiatives. One, it's about envisioning a community. It's about exploring issues, revealing truths. I think painting a picture for a future road ahead, and and when I think employed in larger community context, can actually be an avenue for economic development, for community prosperity, for building bridges and shared kind of shared belief. And I think that the role of the artists often are to be those professionals. And so the one thing I will say that the role of artists within that context is that we're trained to do that. Just like journalists are trained to do stories, we're trained to be those generalists who can look at our the materials we're working with, whether it's going to be paint or words or community, and discover ways in which we can help ourselves and our communities find that vision, to explore those truths. So there's a real powerful role that artists I think have always had. And when we think about when we look at the stories of the past, they're often told through the arts. They're told through the poets. They're told through the paintings that are left over. They're told by the objects that are created, right? And those are incredibly powerful and important. I don't know. I'm rambling on here, Lance.
No. It's so funny. I unmuted because I was like, that is a great place to pick up from. It's like, I feel like that's what people forget. I feel like we've gone further and further away from art being in coordination with civic life, right? Like all of our cultures, it doesn't matter what culture you come from, the artist played a huge role in civic life. Your bridge builder was an artist, your blacksmith was an artist, so on and so forth. And we see that go away, or not go away, but there's this separation that is happening that is just mind-boggling to me. And you're right, we see the materials. So not only do we see physical materials, we see society's materials, and we can think kind of differently about those materials and how those materials can be utilized. That is the role of the artist. Also, you talk about the poets. Poetry and storytelling has kind of been my area of expertise for the past decade. And from my research and from what I've known is like griot, which is a French word adopted by a lot of African cultures. But it's the storyteller. That's kind of how the French word translates it. But in West Africa, I want to say in Mali, it's the Jolly and it's the Doma. Those are the two griots, quote unquote, the two storytellers. But the Jolly, his purpose is to tell a story and entertain. So he tells about the local affairs and everything else. And then the Doma, he cannot tell a lie. And the Doma is charged with telling the history of the land. So he not only can he not tell a lie, but he has to know the entire history of that area and of that land. And we see that distinction within our artists. Some art kind of is meant to entertain or have a satire about what's going on in life. And there's other art artists, editorial writers, so on and so forth, who need to tell the specific details and the facts about something. So Oscar Wilde quote is, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life," right? And we need to think about this when we're thinking about violence prevention and when we're thinking about art. If you hear from the art violence, social inequity, so on and so forth, then you can be sure that there is some part there is a life being lived out there that is seeing these things happen. So yeah, as artists, we are tasked to kind of tell that story, to kind of shout it from the rafters. Always, sorry, and I'm about to wrap up, but artists can they can transcend between the classes, right? They kind of move in between both the bourgeoisie and the 1% and the proletariat and the lumpen proletariat. They move in between these working classes or non-working classes, and it is there that they, like, our art is the communicator that spans class, race, any demographic. Keep going.
Great, thanks, Lance. Brian, did you want to share your art piece around gun?
Well,
I mean,
actually,
I've so
Well,
people can see, I've got an example of one that you did. You want to talk about that project?
well, that one was, a part of a project exploring power. And the concept with that one was to, take the gun, which is, this like very powerful symbol of violence, of domination, of patriarchy, and try to defang it. And so I created a project called Unfired Arms. And so I cast, guns, and used clay to make the guns, and then did not. In ceramics, you fire things to make them hard. So your plates are just the clay you get out of the ground, but when you fire them to a certain temperature, they become these hard, durable objects, right? And so I did not fire the guns. So they were these really fragile, delicate objects that, if you picked them up, they'd break, and so they, and they actually weren't guns at the same time. And so the whole idea was to, engage, the gallery audience, in a little play around the idea of guns. So I created the guns, and I created a booth and sold them as such to people. And it was interesting to see their engagement, even with, something that really isn't a gun. I mean, it's an unfired piece of clay, right? That's really fragile, but, it was, people approach, this concept of a gun, in a really frightful way, or they approach it as this, enormous symbol of power. So, some would just automatically pick them up and they would disintegrate in their hands. Others wouldn't even approach the booth, because they were afraid of the, the implication of that. So, it was a really great project.
Lance, how about you? Do you have a?
I was about to say, yeah, no, I don't. For the poems, you all can go to YouTube to find poetry, but I am also a visual artist. In my background right here, this is a visual arts piece that I created. What you see are different chalk outlines. It's really taped plexiglass, and these are like supposed to represent chalk outlines that happen after murder victims. On each of those pieces, on each of those pieces is written the news stories. I thought that was kind of interesting that we're having that conversation, but written on the art pieces are the news stories of various people that I know, people that I came in contact with that have died from gun violence. And then the chalkboard and the back has a whole bunch of names of different people who have lost their lives to gun violence. So that's one of my art pieces that speak to that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to open this up. We've got just a few more minutes, but there may be some questions from those that are on the Zoom call. Would love for you to have some time to ask some questions, and the panelists for you all to be able to reflect with each other as well. Ruth Ann, would you want to unmute yourself and ask the question that you asked? I thought it was really helpful and an interesting question. Or do you want me to read it from the chat box?
It's okay. I was just wondering, lots of times, especially on television news, you will see people supposedly tracking and presenting the story. And I'm seeing it from a different perspective. And so what I'm wondering is, when it's all over with, do they sit down with each other and say, did we do this? Did we miss it? And a perfect example is during the protests the station that I was watching put a great deal of emphasis on this trash barrel that was on fire. And they did not say one word about the two people who came up and used their water bottle to put out the fire. And it just seems to me that if after it was over with, and of course everybody was feeling tense at the time, even the people in the newsroom, but after it was over with, it would have been nice if that interchange ended up revealing, hey, wait a minute, we were so interested in the deplorable that we forgot to bring in the human part of it that was trying to make things better. So my question was, is that part of your system? And Kristin, it sounds like it is from what you answered. So maybe you would want to add more.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can expand on it. I was saying in the chat that broadcast news moves so fast because it's a huge story. We have to get it down sometimes to like a minute, 30 seconds. And so we don't always look at every single story in every single show, but I think for the most part, at least, we try to do a great job at knowing when we miss the mark. And sometimes, you know, you're human, you do miss the mark, but you have to be honest about yourself and say, you know what, we can do better the next time. And I will say in the coverage that I've seen in news across many different platforms is a stark difference in how the protests were covered early on and how they're covered later in the summer and how they're maybe covered now. And so from my perspective, at least I have seen the growth. I watch a lot of news, probably more than the average person, but I've seen the growth in more of an accurate tone in the coverage that accurately reflects rioters versus protesters, you know, versus January 6th insurrectionists and different things like that, calling people and calling things for what they are. And so we don't always critique every show, but at least at WHAS, we look at shows at kind of random and say, did we get it right or did we miss the mark? And how can we improve for the next time? And so that's what we do. We definitely try to look at our product that we put on air, because if we don't look at it and we don't critique it, you know, and sometimes tear it to shreds, then how can we grow? And we also listen to people too. So Roseanne, I'm so happy that you asked that question, because it's always interesting what we see from the news being in it and what others see from the news from outside perspective, which is so valuable because we see things sometimes different than who we're presenting the news to. So your opinion and your thoughts are appreciated and so necessary to hear because it provides a different perspective for us.
Thank you. And Vita, what kind of pushback the series that you did on Breonna Taylor and looking at the systemic racism, that was such a powerful, in fact, I still go back and pull down quotes from that on the website. And if people don't know that, you can go and find those stories together. What kind of pushback did you get from those series of stories?
From the
community, or what? I would imagine they weren't all received that well, but
yeah, and we had, and I'll just again name, you know, Bailey Loosemore and Hayes Gardner, who did that series and really put in the work and just did a great job. You know, we heard from people even before, you know, before we did the series, we heard people saying there's no such thing as systemic racism. You know, it just doesn't exist. So, and that was just like, you know, we got to do these stories. You know, maybe people don't see it. You know, maybe we can show it. And then so we got some people, you know, who responded, you know, negatively. But we also got people who, you know, reached out to help. We one story that Bailey did about the woman being evicted. You know, she had someone contact her and say, how can I want to help that person, you know, and that was wonderful. I mean, that matters so much more than, you know, the 5 or 10 comments that are negative and that are from people who, you know, just may never change their perspective.
Thank you. Yeah. And people can find that on the Courier Journal page, right? So all under that section. Yeah.
Yes. Beyond Breonna series. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to open it up to anybody on Zoom that wants to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment. Let's have a little conversation here. Anybody's welcome to do that. If you would like to engage in the conversation, please do. Just unmute yourself and jump in. So, well, I've got plenty of questions. One of the, a friend of mine, Richard Whitlock, he often comments or has shared several times that if he were to just watch news stories, he's a young Black man, he said, I would be afraid of my own self. So the internalization of the external messages that media gives is a form of violence to those populations if that's the only messages they begin receiving. So what are the proactive ways, or what are the narratives, and our artists or our media folks can answer this, what are the narratives you would like to change that you really think are false narratives, or what are the ones that you think are really important that we start addressing as artists and as media folks? Is there a specific narrative or an issue that you feel like is important to engage?
I think that we have started this work, but I think that it's important to not feed into stereotypes when we talk about people. And so I know Vita mentioned this too, just having diversity in your newsroom so that your coverage is diverse and your coverage is more accurate and more even and more fair to people. So I think fighting those stereotypes is important to do. And I think that it's worth the fight for sure, just so that we get it right. There's no way you can group an entire group of people into one narrow lane. And to have that perception from others is unfair to everyone, because they may be closed off to people who may be amazing people, but they never know because in their mind, they have already prejudged them.
I always wonder about your all's control, my media folk. I always wonder, like, is it the morning you guys have your stories that you kind of have to cover and then kind of spitball different stories of interest, or is it like we always hear about controlling the narrative, right? Artists are kind of given the leeway, right? We don't have anybody paying our bills, right, and keeping our lights on, so we can kind of shape the narrative how we see fit. With you all, y'all have to kind of work in a more strict parameter, and I always wonder, like, how much wiggle room do you have, and is there like more wiggle room to be had?
I can answer that. I mean, because and you have to answer that on more than one level, because there's the reporter level, right, where we have reporters who cover beats and they basically come back to their editors with ideas, stories that they want to tell, and there's a lot of leeway for them then to kind of pick and choose the things that they think are interesting or that they think the community wants to read about or that are important to write about. And so they come to me, for example, and I have to listen to them and determine, yes, that's a story, or no, I don't think we should pursue that. So there's that level. Then there's the level, where I'm at with the editors. And every morning when we sit there and we talk about in our news meetings what stories we're doing, at that point, if I hear something doesn't sound right, I'm like, what is that story? Are we making sure that we talk to people, in the West End about that? Are we, I can then be in a position to start asking questions that can change, whether or not we actually publish that story, or if we make sure that that story is broader. So, but then Lance, you raise a good question, because if no one's in the room at that level that is thinking like that, that is sensitive to those things. And I'm not saying you have to be, Black to be sensitive to those issues. You just have to, be more aware and be paying attention and care. But if you don't have someone at that level, then you're gonna have a problem.
Right on. Appreciate that.
Can I jump in? Hi, I'm Joyce. I'm a journalist, and so I'm very interested in this conversation. And I would just say, in addition to diversity in terms of race, gender, religion, etc., I think diversity of consciousness is important as well. And I'm wondering, the media people and the artist people, both aim at truth. With how effective do you think you are at in what you do, changing people's minds, educating people, changing consciousness? Or, I mean, I find sometimes that facts, no matter how factual, don't necessarily do it. So artists, do you think that coming from a more emotional inner place has viability? So it's for both print media people and artists. Question.
Well,
Brian, you want to take that?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
go ahead.
I would say absolutely. I mean, there's different ways in which you can deliver the message, right? And our news media have a real important role in kind of presenting facts as they are now, and digging into the stories and providing a certain level of truth. But there's a level of truth that sits under that layer of consciousness. It's the one that we know. It's the one we've grown up with for years, that has kind of been omnipresent in our community. And I think one of the things that and now it's being dug up. I think the artists have always known that, and they've been speaking these truths for years. Sometimes it takes a while for the news media to pick up on it. But and I do agree with Lance that artists don't have have a little bit more freedom and leeway in exploring those things. But even in the arts, we have to be looking at the structures that have kept voices of color out of our institutions, and then oftentimes has been celebrated in a way that is for the profit of others rather than their own communities. And I think that's a real big problem. And when I see the next people that we have in a lot of our institutions where we have not invested in our communities in a way that will allow people of color to get access to healthcare and education and pathways into professional career paths, or they've been specifically denied that. And that long history is what we see. The lack of diversity comes from that. And those are we need to be changing that right now. It's not only providing opportunities for those that are practicing now to be part of those institutions, but laying the groundwork for more and more opportunity for young people to be able to find their ways into curatorial practice and being producers and being directors and being the people that lead those conversations and invest in those conversations more directly.
And I wanted to add that, like, it's interesting. It's so funny. I'm a poet. We talk in stories. And I think this is a real quick story about, like, I recently got a contract for a group. It's a corporate group out of state in Texas, and they wanted a poem during their Black History Month program. So I sent over a couple of poems, and they wrote me back and said, can we dial it down? Like, can we not challenge this part of the society? Can we not challenge this? They wanted an Amanda Gorman. That's what I'm kind of putting it, because now Amanda Gorman kind of got poets the hot ticket, right? It's like everybody wants a poet to open up their thing. And it's like, I am made, because it's a corporate structure, I'm made to kind of fit into the parameters of what they're comfortable with, instead of doing my job as an artist and putting a truth for them to confront, right? And I feel like on a macro level, that's what we are dealing with in society, especially when it comes to the artists, kind of giving that truth. So I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. Yeah. Other, just a few more minutes, but other questions or any comments that panelists would like to make kind of in beginning to close down? Again, we're trying to focus on actions. What are things that we can do? So from your perspectives as artists and media representatives, what can we do as a city to address these things? Do you have certain ideas or actions we can take as citizens to join you in that work?
I wanted to offer an example to the last question about, if we're making a difference at all. And I was walking through my neighborhood, and one of the people who lives there, a white man, he doesn't know that I work for the Courier or anything, but he just sees me walking and he stops me, ma'am. And he tells me that he has learned more in the last 5 months than he has learned in a lifetime about the struggles of people of color. And I was, I told him, I said, thank you. I was really touched by that because, again, he doesn't know I work for the Courier or anything, but I feel like getting the information out there, raising awareness, is so important. And it is such a major part of what we have to do as the media, and getting it right, of course, but getting that story out there and not just focusing on problems, but actually looking at solutions, writing about those solutions. And then I haven't mentioned editorials. I'm over editorials, opinion pieces, and bringing all those voices in from the community. I got so many pieces from white people basically writing about white silence and saying it has to stop. It was amazing to get so many pieces saying that from white people, just every week I was getting them. And so just being able to get those out there, to publish them online in print, I think that can help change the narrative, because it can help change perspectives. And so it's important. What we do is extremely important as artists, as journalists. I feel like I'm an artist now because Lance, the way he described artists.
No, y'all, hey, I swear y'all are, because it's a whole art in how we give information, right? They said Einstein or somebody real smart said, if you can take something really complicated and make a child understand it, then you're a genius, because that is what true genius is, right? Like filtering information so that it's digestible. Yeah.
Piggybacking off of what Vita was talking about, we've done stories on racial disparities, not only in the criminal justice department, but in healthcare and education, because racial disparities really are prevalent in nearly every aspect of everyday life. Housing, it expands to wide varieties. And so I think, for my perspective, it is important to stay the course. And it's easy to sometimes maybe get emotional about things that you're passionate about, but it's important to kind of stay the course and make sure that you're sticking with what your job is, which is, as a journalist, to inform people. And we know some truths, right? We already know people are racist. We already know this. And we know systemic racism exists. Some people don't, because they have never had to face that reality. And so you back up that information with facts, because it's hard to argue with the numbers. People cannot like it. They can think it's, this is crazy, but if it's a fact, it's a fact, and there's no arguing with numbers. So when we talk about racial disparities in healthcare, we mention those numbers. When we talk about racial disparities in education, how Black students are suspended at disproportionate rates, we mention those numbers and those studies. And when we talk about it in the criminal justice system, whether it's dealing with arrests or bail or the amount of the sentencing, we mention those numbers because you can back up the information with facts. And it's just hard to argue with numbers, because this is what happened. You don't have to like it, but it is what it is.
Exactly.
And so you can't always control what people do with that information, but as long as you get that information to them and you inform them, you have done your job. Because your burden, to me, is not on changing people, it's on presenting that information to them. And whether or not they want to change their opinion and be open-minded, that is on them. But you have done your job. And for every person that you think you haven't changed, or you think you haven't informed, you have informed someone else. And you don't maybe always hear, but if you hear from one person, that one person is representative of more than one person.
I literally was going to say the same thing, Kristin. It's about, like, folk ask, what can I do? Like, you must be an activist in your circles. You must be showing these numbers in your circles. You must have the courage. Y'all, I know it's going to take a lot of courage to kind of confront the racism that exists within ourselves and also in our circles. But that courage will be rewarded, truly, if we can just muster it up and challenge everything we kind of come in contact with that is of negative, negative or just outright racist, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to say something. I'm an
Please.
81-year-old person. Brian's our son-in-law, so we're partial to this. But in 81 years, I've seen an awful lot of improvement in diversity, from coming from a all-white neighborhood to teaching at the university where people do have a chance. But the virus that we have and Black Lives Matter bring to the forefront how much more we have to do yet. But it's a lot better now than it was 81 years ago.
Yeah, thank you. And
Can I respond to that, Judd?
of course, and here's Richard. Richard, I was quoting you earlier, so welcome to the conversation.
Now I'm talking about my response to it is let's say better would mean that it's less racism, right? And what I call it is racism is just more eloquent than it used to be. Racism in this country used to be a Neanderthal kind of racism, right? And now racism has become corporate. It's like it went from being a Viking thing to being a night thing, right? It's just more eloquent. And what I want other people to understand, if racism is eloquent or not, Black people still have to deal with something that our ancestors should have never had to deal with. And those are the challenges. Like people say, hey, I want to make things better for my children and my grandchildren. I really believe that we can have an America without ghettos, and we can also have an America without racism once we realize we don't need these things in our society anymore.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I appreciate your truth telling. We're about out of time, folks. I would be open if any of our panelists specifically have any kind of final thoughts or responses. I'm just so deeply grateful that you all are where you are doing the work you're doing, the courage and strength that you all show in truth telling, telling your stories, telling other people's stories. And from my perspective, I've never seen so many white people, I think, asking the right questions. We're asking different questions, I think. And the reason is because Black people, brown people have taken the courage to continue to speak truth. And so I do see hope in that sense, that I do see a movement happening of beloved community. And it's thanks to the gifts and the strength of our Black and brown brothers and sisters doing that work. And also white people, I think, beginning to do a different level of work. And again, I want to make sure we refocus the narrative around violence and talk about, systemic whiteness and the violence caused by whiteness, white power and privilege. It is a form of violence that we also need to name and to be clear about sharing that narrative and reflecting on that. Any final words from our panelists specifically? Thanks so much for being here.
I would have a final word. I would encourage people, if you feel like there is more to learn, because there's always so much to learn and all of us can always continue to grow. A nice thing for me has been reading. I'm an avid reader, and so reading different genres and reading different experiences of people have really kind of opened up my mindset, even as someone who is Black and who understands some of the things that people go through. But it's very another form of education. You don't have to be in school, to learn. And so I know one thing that stood out to me was a book by Austin Channing Brown, and it just kind of spoke on the progress that we've had and that we've seen, but how she's not impressed with it. because where we started, we should never have started there. So it's just kind of like, there are definitely praiseworthy progress that we have seen, but where we started, we should not have ever started there. So I thought that was interesting how she put it. She just put it like, she's not impressed that slavery was abolished or that Jim Crow ended, because we never should have been there. We never should have been there. And it's just so interesting. But I really enjoy personally reading a lot of different books because we can always continue to grow just as people.
I'm gonna jump in and give my book suggestion. Y'all read Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kennedy. Stamped from the Beginning. It's a great book, his history book. And I'm a firm believer that we have to know where these origins started so that we can correct them for the future.
Thanks, Lance. Vida, and then Brian, final checkout words.
I just want to thank you for holding this panel, and it's been wonderful just hearing all the different perspectives. I would say also that I love hearing from the community, and please don't hesitate to send, letters, opinion pieces. It's important that the voices be heard from across our community, and the narrative doesn't just have to be, written by the reporters, the professional reporters or artists, but you can also have your voice be heard. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you.
Thanks, Vida. Appreciate it. Brian, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, let me share it as a picture. Can I share my screen?
Yes, I can make you a co-host here. Yes, if you want to share your screen.
Go. All right, can you see this? So this is a project in Birmingham, and these were the first kids that were showing up at the back door, of our studio, and the project ended up morphing into, the creation of all these bricks, as we called them, and they were about people's lives and the things that they thought were their own reality. And here's a couple of the kids from another project. But the final piece was this. So if you're down in Birmingham sometime and you're walking along the museum there, take a look and see that piece. That's when artists, help communities kind of visualize, something, things like this big and beautiful can happen.
Beautiful. That's awesome, Brian. Thank you. What a great way to end, as appropriate with these kinds of images. Well, thank you all so much for being here and being on. And it does take all of us to do our unique part wherever we are in order to create the beloved community. And a deep bow to all of you who are doing that work. And that gives me hope and inspiration that we can slowly shift the boat. So thanks for those that have joined us on Facebook and on Zoom, and I hope you'll continue to engage our Thursday afternoon programs. Next week will be organizations that are working specifically in violence reduction. Have a lot of great panelists for that. And then remember the Reckoning Forum. The Reckoning Forum, again, is designed to highlight those that are doing this work in their own communities and maybe under-resourced. So show up and bring your inspiration and your resources to help those that are doing the work of beloved community and anti-violence in our communities, including Richard. Richard will be one of our panelists at the Reckoning Forum, and he's doing some really amazing work, and we can figure out how we can support and join him. You're welcome to unmute yourself and say goodbyes in this cacophony of thanks and greetings to one another. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for having
So
us.
much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Panel, that was great, really. Thanks.
Thanks, Joyce.
Much love, y'all.
Yeah.
Lance, I love the fact you're making art the whole time.
I know, it's beautiful, right?
Yeah.
You're just going at it.
Working on something. You can't see it. Much love.
Love it, man.
Take care.
Thank you
All right, y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Peace.